product manager on the Edge team. And as part of that work, I spend a good chunk of my time, probably about half my time, going around the company and consulting with other teams to try to help understand kind of how it's going. Because we want to do, as platform makers, we want to do intentional learning. We want to help teams who are having difficulties using the web and the platform learn what's possible and use the latest and greatest that we have put into the browser, but not just because we want to make their products better, although that is front and foremost for the company, but also because by doing that work and partnering with them, we get a chance to sit with them and peer over their shoulders and see what actually hurts, rather than like a kind of game of telephone that you might get, where a lot of folks kind of come to you and tell you, "Oh, this is what's happening." And so that's kind of an intentional learning effort that I do now on the Edge team, and I did for many years when I was part of the Chrome team, working with the business development and developer relations teams to sit with teams who are building progressive web apps since 2015. And so I've talked to hundreds of teams at this point. I've worked with hundreds of teams to help them touch up or analyze and deeply, reconsider some of their technology choices all the way through the stack in order to build great experiences on all kinds of form factors and devices. And so that has given me a real tour as an embed with many folks who are having good times building for the web, and as often as not, it turns out bad times. So I want to talk about it. I think we all need to talk about it, because my TLDR is that it's not going as well as maybe some conferences would tell you it is. So in 1970, George Akerlof published his most famous paper called "The Market for Lemons." And in this paper, he introduced economists to the fundamental idea of information asymmetry, using the idea of bad cars, lemons, in the resale market as an example. And this example is pretty trenchant because it depends on the idea that buyers know a lot less about the quality of the goods for sale than the sellers do. That is to say, if you are in the car business and you buy cars from people and sell them on to people, you might have a lot more information about the quality of that car than either the person selling it to you or the person that you then sell it on to. Good middlemen are worth their weight in gold, but good middlemen require a fluid market. You have to have a lot of information and a lot of trust. And so in markets where information about quality is not easy to come by, it's possible for markets to wind up moving through a lot of lemons. And lemons are bad not just for the people who get less money than they could for the things that they sell on to the middlemen and pay more than they should to the people who sell them on to them, but also for anyone who wants to participate in the market, whether or not they have a good quality good or that they'd like to sell a lot of, or something low quality. It's going to be mispriced. And that means that good quality stuff eventually kind of moves out of the market. And so Akerlof used the idea of the market for lemons as a way to illustrate the information asymmetry problem in a lot of different kinds of markets. And he says, there's an incentive for sellers to market poor quality merchandise, since the returns for good quality accrue mainly to the entire group whose statistic is affected rather than the individual seller. And I postulate that this is what's going on with front-end tools. We have not had a good way to price the externalities of many of the goods and services that are being marketed quite heavily to developers. And as a result, we may have a market full of lemons today. So let's look at how it's going. What do we know? And to do that, I think it's important to do a couple of explicit exercises in turning the subtext of our assumptions about how the device and network and market landscape that we are building goods and services for, building websites that we want to deliver to people for, how that's actually going and what that market looks like. So we want to turn our subtext into text and make our assumptions explicit. One assumption that I have heard on a loop for most of the last decade is that CPUs are fast now. And that may have been true in 2013 when we started down what I have come to call the Great Branch Mispredict. But about the same time, most browsing went mobile. That is to say, phones are now where most browsing happens. And that has remained true. That's not going to be a temporary feature of the world. Now, maybe some new form factor will take a bite out of this and it'll become more contested. But until something replaces the phone is where browsing happens, to a first approximation. And so it kind of doesn't matter whether or not you think you're building a website for desktop. You're building a website for desktop and people who are on phones too. And that means that we have to pay attention to those devices and the actual market for those devices, what they look like, who's using them, what situations they're in, because the market for desktop computing used to rely on Moore's law and relatively fixed latency wired networks. And none of that's true anymore. And obviously, I can't see you all, but I wish I could. So if you could virtually put your hand up, if you carry an iPhone, that'd be helpful. And if you carry an iPhone that's less than 18 months old, that would also be helpful. And great, because if you do, globally, that makes you kind of a weirdo. And I don't think that that reality has percolated into our conversation in ways that are particularly well understood. It has not been true that Apple sells more than half of phones since something like 2012. In most years, it'll be something like 15 to 20%. Now, you may see news stories that say Apple sold the most, devices of any manufacturer, and that the two things can be simultaneously true. On the one hand, Apple has relatively few SKUs. That is to say, a very small product range. And there is a huge number of Android devices in the world. And those devices are split among many manufacturers across many price points, across many subdivided SKUs. And so by concentrating on a small number of products and product lines in a single manufacturer, you can sell the most of any and still only account for 15 to 20% of the market. And that is the world, that the global world for smartphones. The data here, you could extend this chart on forever and still be pretty true. Average selling prices are a little bit more contended. And I will say, there's a lot of nuance to all of this data. There's a lot of texture. The surface, thing I'm giving you is not the whole story, and it won't be the story necessarily in your market either. In some wealthy markets, you'll see a much higher proportion of iPhones to Android devices. In almost no markets, however, will you see more than 50% of devices being sold being iPhones. Now, and again, to give you a sense of the texture, usage and sales are different. Device lifetimes have an impact, but also wealth in terms of access to networks and data, as well as the correlated impact of affluence and value of online services. But the average selling price globally for smartphones probably isn't what you paid for yours, especially if you had your hand up earlier. If you take the data series back to about 2016, in constant dollar terms, it was near 300 and it poked up above 300 in 2021. But the average selling price for Androids, where most of the market is, again, is lower. And if we look at more recent data, things go a little bit wobbly because pandemics do extremely strange things to economies. Prices, as you know from news articles about inflation, have done strange things. We had in many geographies, we had pandemic era support for home budgets, which created outsized demand for electronics of all sorts, including phones. And that was followed by increases in prices due to supply chain bottlenecks, and then other impacts related to inflation, including what you might hear referred to as greedflation, which reportedly in the US accounts for about half of the total price increase. So people taking profits, which means that you may get less for your dollar this year than you did last year, even in constant dollar terms. And that is global, but it also has a local texture to it as well. So note that this is weird, but we're going to talk in broad strokes. But if we look at more up-to-date data, the middle of this chart is right now. The right-hand side is projection. The left-hand side is a separate estimate of average selling prices. So this data is like, there are so many people who make phones, and there are so many different phones made, and how those get into the channel and how they leave the channel is all kind of a squint kind of game. But IDC's different view onto this data suggested the average selling price was north of 300, looking at 330 back in 2019, and has bumped up by a third, up to 400 and close to $440. But you'll note that the average selling price for Androids in the same chart has not done the same thing. It's still sub $300, even with inflation and all of these other effects. What's going on? Well, the rich people who continue to buy phones at a relatively constant rate are paying a lot more for their phones now. The average selling price for an iOS device this year went north of $1,000 for the very first time. That is an unbelievable amount of money for a consumer electronic device that is effectively a consumable for most people around the world. So we're seeing a delamination. The mid and low end are kind of not fixed, but they're where they were in terms of price. And so the thing that's going to determine what reality looks like for our customers, for our median and further out in the distribution customers, is not the $1,000 phone in our pockets. It is something else. And that something else is related to forces that we see in the high end, but not nearly as directly as at the low end. So what are we talking about? Well, this is a chart of Geekbench 5 scores. This is a data series that I've been collecting for the last, call it 8 years now, where we look at what the single and multi-core performance of devices is at the very highest end in the iOS ecosystem, the very highest end in that year, that the first half year announced in the Android ecosystem, a median price device, which is to say somewhere in that, somewhere $300 to $400 range, and then a low end device, something in the $100 to $150 range. And again, the thing to understand is that almost all of the volume in these markets is not at the high end, right? The high end is wealthy people, and wealthy people are considered wealthy because they're weird. They're unusual in the world, right? If everybody was wealthy, then we wouldn't have that term. So the people paying $1,000 for a phone are not like most people in the world. And that is to say, they are not like most people using your websites, unless you're selling Prada handbags, in which case that's different. But for those of us who aren't, the fact that multi-core and single-core scores at the middle and down in the distribution have not kept up. And even at the high end in Android land, if you spend $800, $900 on a Pixel, you will still receive a CPU that is 2 years behind an iOS device. If all you're testing on is an iOS device, I got news for you. That's not real life. So what should you take away from this? Well, there are no fast Androids and there are no slow iPhones. And the world is mostly Androids. If that is not something that you're sitting with or testing with, if you don't have cheap devices surrounding you at your desk, you may not be building something for the people who are going to be trying to use your services, which means that your services may experience hysteresis. People may try to use it and bounce off, and you won't see them in your data. Okay. And this matters because the set of people in the world who are only on smartphones correlates heavily with folks who cannot afford $1,000 phones. That is to say, the more dependent you are on your phone, the less likely you are to have bought a fast phone. So the people who need services on devices like this the most are the people who can least afford the best version of it. This is a constant across the world. Okay, let's look at the desktop. Again, virtual hand up if you have a Mac, and if it's less than 3 years old. I'm not going to call you a weirdo again, but I will just note that Apple has not made something more than like 8%, 9% of all desktop computers. That includes tablets as well as desktop and laptop form factor PCs in something like 10 years, 15 years. That's just a constant. So this is a niche product for wealthy people. If that is the device that you are building and testing on, that means that you are building in a niche and may only have built something that is acceptable to people in a niche. And so it's worth, I think, looking at what the rest of the market looks like. We talked about the average selling price of PCs. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but I would like to introduce you to a device that my company, Microsoft, sells to schools today. This is the Surface SE. It sports a 2 gigahertz Celeron N4020, which is a 2-core device, no hyperthreading. It has 4 GB of RAM, 64 GB of flash, but that is not fast. I don't know if you know the difference between eMMC and like the various different kinds, but like if there's a slow version, that means it's cheap, and the cheap one is what's in here because it costs $250. And it's encased in plastic, which is to say that its thermal performance is the performance of polyurethane. So I don't think you're going to be using that as a conductor. It's more of an insulator. And that means that even those two cores can't get that fast for very long because they overheat quickly, which means that they're thermally throttled a lot of the time. Okay, there is a $330 version, and that is 2 gigahertz US. That is still 2 gigahertz, but it goes up to 4 cores, twice as much RAM, twice as much everything. But it's still encased in plastic, and so it can't go that fast. And this is important because that device is something that we expect our products to work well on. It is also not the case that most developers at Microsoft have one of those on their desk that they're testing. Now, I do because I'm a weirdo in the opposite direction to most folks. But it is the kind of device that we need to be keeping in mind because it represents all of the kind of pandemic era Chromebooks that were bought in haste and fury in order to do Zoom calls for folks who were suddenly finding themselves teaching at home. Or schools that had to buy technology in a hurry without really having a considered plan for what to do and almost no budget to do it. Those are the devices that are walking around today that students still depend on all day long. And so the average selling price in the PC market has stayed between $600 and $700. Today, new phone average selling price has peaked up above 350. It may be as high as 450, depending on various factors. The estimates are wild. And again, pandemics do weird things. So that's the market. That's what we're looking at. So when we talk about what devices our code is going to run on, we're looking at a device that was sold between 2 and 4 years ago at the average selling price. That is the actual median or P75 device, right? The age of that device is not, we don't turn over all of our devices every year, right? We hold them for a while. And that means that those things age. And so what is available today for $300 is nice, but that'll be the median in 2 years or 4 years if you're talking about a PC. Many of the laptops and PCs that are walking around are between 6 and 8 years old. And so this bears out in the data that we see from edge telemetry. Something like 40% of the Windows fleet that's observable to us is sporting spinning rust. That is to say, it has a hard drive, or it has less than 4 gigabytes of RAM, or it's less than 4 cores. Those devices are not fast. And so what you should take away about the desktop ecosystem is that it's mostly old, it's mostly laptops, and it's mostly, and across the world, almost everything is the commodity OS, Android or Windows, not iOS or macOS. Now, you might say to yourself, but most of our users are on fast devices, and everyone has 5G. And these things are assertions that we can try to falsify with evidence. Now, the everyone has fast devices may be true in the sense that your users can only use your service if they are on fast devices. You may be experiencing performance hysteresis. You may be in such a bad space with regards to performance that most people bounce off of it early, and you may not see it in your data because you weren't looking. It's easy to run ablation experiments, but almost nobody does. But the network stuff is harder to diagnose, and so we have to go look at external data to try to understand it. I'm working on an updated blog post that will go into a lot more depth about the real network situation. There is good news. There's good news actually in both the low end of Android hardware and in networks going into 2024. Weirdly, 5G has not necessarily helped anywhere in the sense of it's still a weird thing for you to get, except in some very high data rate applications, which are now being pulled off of 4G networks, which is just making 4G networks better. But it's worth keeping in mind that the technology mix that we see in the world still features 3G heavily, and 4G is going to be the workhorse almost everywhere. And even users who are on 4G wind up being 3G users most of the time. This adage is going to be just as true in the 5G era when that finally arrives, and which, by the way, won't be for another 5 or 6 years. You may have 5G now, but you're a 4G user some or probably most of the time, even if you have a 5G device. That has to do with mass deployment and infrastructure and backhaul and all kinds of complicated things that have to do with spectrum deployment and auctions and that sort of stuff. But like TLDR, you're not going to be living in 5G land now or soon, and neither will your users. So this is true all over the world. We're looking at a 5G world that is 5G in the breach in 2030, not 2024, 2025, 2026. In 5 to 6 years, 5G will still not be the majority of most sessions around the world, right? So GSMA suggests that in Africa, 5G is only going to overtake 2G in 2026. Right? Like, so set your expectations on stun about what networks actually do. And know that this is true about fixed internet as well. Now, there is good news also in the US, specifically. Regulation has a big impact. We've seen significant improvements based on subsidies to rural areas and to folks who are less advantaged with regards to the improvements in performance. And the threat of some regulation has actually caused some of the worst offenders to start to actually improve their network speeds. But if you live in historically redlined areas, you may be paying a lot more per byte too. So a lot of the things that go along with not having historically large amounts of wealth continue to stack in this sense. This is the redlining I was talking about. And it's gutting to see it on the map. It's gutting to see where folks who were disadvantaged from buying houses are now disadvantaged from getting a reasonable internet drop. That is how the compounding effects of disadvantage work. Now you may be thinking to yourself, okay, that's all rough, but we're doing okay. Our team has this unlocked. We just rebuilt on the new stack. We did the thing that everyone says is going to be super fast. We were told that this new thing is performant. Well, okay, so I'm probably older than I look, but I started working to build e-commerce websites on the internet in 1999 as an intern at rca.com. We had a search box, we had a configurator, we had a product detail page, we had a cart, we did checkout, and we did it over 14 4K links to web TVs and to Netscape 4. And so I kind of understand when folks tell me that their WYSI document editor needs a megabyte of JavaScript, but I'm not sure I'm as convinced when someone comes to me with their e-commerce website. And some folks in the world have been learning this lesson and continue to pass it down into their teams. But as a whole, I'm not sure our culture has done that. Amazon, they don't allow, I mean, go look at their pages. Like, you might get some jQuery, but you're definitely not going to get the new shiny. And that means that their performance is good. But there are other top 10 retailers, and these are US-centric, but you can find these examples in most geographies now, where between desktop and mobile, we're looking at a sea of yellow, if not red, relative to their users. So the Core Web Vitals dataset comes not from some bench idea of what that user is. These are the real devices reporting back with anonymized histograms. And when you get enough of that data, you can correlate it to the origin in an anonymous way and say something meaningful about that statistic. And so what we're seeing is that even with the extremely low bar for all the Core Web Vitals targets, and again, I cannot stress enough that the Core Web Vitals targets are good. Core Web Vitals are like, getting to good Core Web Vitals should not be a celebratory moment. That should be the starting point for your team. If you're yellow or red in these metrics, people are having a bad time because these report a P75. That means 1 in 4 visits is a bad time, right? If you're not green. Maybe the second largest e-commerce website in the world is a sea of red. And the commonality between these sites and these experiences doing poorly, even though we have 20 years of building e-commerce websites, which again, I cannot stress, are landing pages for marketing, search boxes, search results pages, product detail pages, carts, and checkout flows. That's what they are. They have been that for 20 to 25 years. There is no WYSI new thing in any of these pages that is fundamentally different than they were 20 years ago, right? The devices have gotten 10 times faster or more. The networks have gotten more than 10 times faster. And yet, here we are. I will assert that this is a lack of a statistic that allows us to correctly price the externalities of the tools that have been sold into the developer ecosystem with fury and with certainty and with some derision for the old guard who told us that we couldn't afford all this new shiny stuff. And it turns out that we were just missing a statistic to price it. And I want to thank the Chrome team for developing the interaction to next paint metric, because for reasons that I won't go into, the first input delay metric had been sandbagged to make bad sites look good. Again, ask me some other time and some other where how that happened. But IMP is going to replace that, and it's going to do a better job of capturing more interactions in sessions. And what we can see is, roughly, this is a bit of an eye chart, but like if you're building for things that build in the old style for most websites, and on most websites, you send HTML first, you're going to do a lot better than if you are dependent fundamentally on JavaScript for interactivity, because JavaScript is extremely expensive. It scales in the properties of the local device and the network that it's attached to, which means that if you send HTML, which is simpler, which browsers process a lot faster, and which we can construct a renderable DOM and CSS tree out of much sooner than waiting for your JavaScript to collect its thoughts, finally generate some DOM, put it on the page and do stuff, then you end up in a situation where by sending something that is fundamentally simpler to the runtime, we can optimize significantly better on your behalf. And you may think, oh, well, browsers should just get smarter. And I'm here to tell you, not as an apologist for browser engineering, as I think we could be a lot better in a lot of ways. But that's not what's going on. What's going on here is that we have decided that we're going to bring on board a lot of complexity into our stacks, and that complexity has costs. And today we have just been externalizing those costs. Those costs have been put onto the user. And IMP is going to price those costs such that those effects are now things that we have to pay for inside of our own teams. And that pricing function has been missing from the conversation. When we price these things, it's going to turn out that the wind in your hair feeling of the developer experience getting better may have actually just been you rolling coal in someone else's face. Okay. And that's what it looks like. That's what the average statistics look like. What you would like to see in a world where the median and low-end CPUs are not getting a lot faster because process nodes have been stuck in the same place for a long time, and people are costing down their fabs, and we have been doing spread of technology as Moore's law plays out every year, where we get another doubling of transistor count for the same dollar. Instead of making a faster device, we just make more of them, and we sell them at a lower price to more people, because that's what's happening as we replace feature phones and dumb phones with smartphones worldwide. That is incompatible with doing a good job if this is the amount of script that we're going to send every year. If this line stayed flat for a couple of years, we might be okay. Silicon and network progress might eclipse it, right? We might climb back into a place where we're healthy, but today we're not healthy because of this. And I think that this has added up to what I've started to refer to as a lost decade. Collectively, as a front-end community, we have mispriced the costs associated with the technologies that we've been enthusiastic about. And I don't blame engineers, by the way. I just want to make it very clear that I think that this is a management failure. The job of managers is to manage. It is not the engineer's job at Target or Walmart who did, functionally a terrible thing to their users, and probably to the business as well, that they were allowed to ship something which regressed a bunch of metrics, presumably. It's management's job to manage. So we all have our enthusiasms. I love a lot of dead technology or technologies that will never take off for probably good reasons. And it's management's job to keep that in line, and our product management class has failed us. So what I'm seeing in this incidental consulting that we're doing is, a industry-wide failure. We see lots of scrub countdowns, people getting to the end of a prototyping or development process and realizing they can't launch something. So they have to scrub the whole gosh darn thing after years of development in some cases. More often, though, we see launch directly into ground, where something gets off the pad nominally, and then it finds itself exploding in a field. Some teams can get themselves into far enough off the pad that it's a surprise when the metrics come back. The rapid unplanned disassemblies from bad performance tend to correlate with systems that have situated user bases that eventually then grow, right? So you start something out in a test population, and then you deploy it to a much larger population. That population looks different. Its characteristics are less like the wealthy people who developed it and more like everyone else. And there you go. And then in probably the majority of cases today, we don't see success. We see things that actually limp into orbit and then find out that they can't complete the mission. This is the worst thing. This is what I think of as the developer experience of modern front end. Sorry, I should not say modern front end. Modern implies good. Modern implies taste. I should say contemporary front end. Contemporary is contested. And contemporary front end ends up with a lot of these suborbital suboptimal insertions because they are extremely expensive to relitigate. You can't service it easily once it's out of the atmosphere. It's hard to send a team up to go fix it, but you have to do it anyway if you have any hope at all of salvaging it. And in many cases, it may be easier to write it off, but no one wants to do it. So teams get themselves into this situation, and those teams find themselves with months and months and months of remediation work in front of them. And these are the teams that I'm sitting with. And I want this to end. These teams are in pain. They're in trouble. It hurts. No one wants to be doing a bad job for their users. So when someone tells you that the developer experience is the reason to adopt some technology, imagine your future self sitting in that meeting where you were told, congratulations, you launched the thing, except the tanked all our metrics. Now we've got to spend 6 months shipping no new features. Instead, going back and figuring out why it doesn't work for most of our users. We do this at Google. Sorry, we do this as a continuation of the work I did at Google in a project in the Edge team. We call it Project Sidecar, where we go around and we help all these teams to try to do it. Most of them find themselves in one or more of these situations. That's a bad time. It's a bad time for those teams. It's a bad time for our users. I would like for you to have a better time. We have done this recently with Outlook. We shipped something, a brand new version of Outlook, where everything that's in that red is now web technology. This is Outlook.com, basically, in what we call a Web v2. That is the new version of Outlook. So we're making more of our stuff out of web stuff. The new version of Teams, same deal. We make almost all of our desktop stuff out of web stuff. And so it matters a lot that our web stuff is good. But the tools and technologies that have been sold into our teams are not compatible with doing a good job for most of our users most of the time. And we have the same thing in Edge. This is our Browser Essentials tool, which tells you basically how your session is going and the stuff that we've been doing to make it good for you. This is web content. You can go to it at a URL, edge://browser-essentials. And that means that we can put it on the bench as part of an internal hosted version of the performance analyst webpagetest.org called the Performance Analysis Service inside of Microsoft. And PAS is basically a system that lets us, emulate a low-end device and a low-end network and figure out how it's going. Obviously, the network isn't involved here, so only the device and the disk. But when we rewrote systems that were built in React on the left-hand side here to something that was built in modern web technology, contemporary to modern, we ended up going almost twice as fast, more than twice as fast on the bench. And for real world users across the entire distribution, we've doubled the speed. So we play this again in slow motion. You see we paint faster, we're done faster. This is rolling out to our users right now. And this is going to turn into many more surfaces in Edge. I think collections and downloads are next. So I think it's important for us to take off the glasses we've been wearing. We've been looking at contemporary front end and try to get a little bit more modern about things. We need to make our product managers and our engineering managers use devices that represent the real world and hopefully their real world networks too. The good news is that these devices are cheap. It's not an expensive thing to go live like the other half. It's straightforward. It just involves going to Amazon and getting something delivered that isn't very expensive. It's probably under your expensing budget limit before you have to declare things. And we've been doing this inside of Microsoft too, where our development tools are starting to emulate a baseline device and network. If you are a Microsoft developer, whenever you open Edge DevTools, we start to throttle you automatically so that you get a sense for what it's like to have one of those low-end devices on your desk too. How we need to change our thinking. We need to move from thinking about our data models being always local and always building for fast iterations on local state to thinking about things that are much more like what real users' sites are most of the time, where we have shallow sessions where users interact relatively few times, and those interactions count against a very low denominator. And then I'd like to assert that we should all be managing for minimum client complexity. What you should take away from this is that unless you are deeply in touch with the population of networks and devices in the world of the users that you're serving, it's extremely likely that you're going to be wrong if you assume that they're good. And that means that everything is much more expensive. And that means that complexity costs more on the client. And so you should try to centralize your complexity on the server rather than the client. I think we're out of time here, but I've got some questions that you should send to your managers, and or if you're a manager, you should take them on board or read Helen Elliott McRae's excellent questions for new technology post. Anyway, hire people to solve problems with HTML and CSS, not to make them with JavaScript. That's my plea to you at the end. And thanks. I guess we've got a little bit of time for questions.
Thanks, Alex. That was great. I think I really wanted you to talk because I think this is a super important message. And I'm gonna throw out, maybe, I don't know if it's a spicy opinion or not, but like, the argument you made that like we bought into these for developer experience and then paid for it at the end, like the end users are paying for that choice. But I also feel like, I mean, if you look at developers now, I mean, I see so many posts about how complex things have gotten that did we really end up with a better developer experience? I'm not so certain anybody won in the bargain, personally. This is just my, again, spicy opinion on it.
The way I try to ground myself about that, I mean, I share the same intuition, but I'm skeptical of my own intuitions, right? So I want to ground my I want to ground my beliefs in the same way that I would ground an analysis about, like I don't want to spend time on performance, right? If networks and devices were fast enough and I didn't have to care, I wouldn't care. That'd be great.
Yeah.
So the way I ground my intuition about this is to ask, okay, where is the evidence? And at this point, given how much the absolute tidal wave of marketing that has washed over developers over and over and over again about how DX is so important and it leads to better user experiences, I would expect there to be just a towering pile of research that justifies this in a way that's not only correlated, that like bleeds into causality. I have seen none of it. If you've seen it, or if anyone else has seen it, please send it to me. I'm easy to get a hold of. Let's see. Yeah. You can get a hold of me here. But like, why are we not awash in evidence, right? Like, where is it?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the Fermi paradox, but for developer experience, right?
Yep, for sure. We do have a couple audience questions too. I know we're running out of time, but I do definitely want to get to them. Savannah asks, not making assumptions about end users, consumers' access is often overlooked. I saw it as far back as high school and college, assuming people had reliable internet access when maybe 50% did. What tools or advice do you have for those that want to build their sites and apps inclusively?
Again, get cheap devices. Get, use, build on, build with cheap devices. Like a quote unquote slow phone or a quote unquote slow computer is so much faster than like the developer machines we built most of the internet with. Like I just it's mind-boggling to me just how fast modern devices are, and I mean phones too, right? Like my phone not only has 8 cores, it's got more L2 cache than most of the computers I had in college, right? Like we can make fast websites now. It is a question of will and grounding. And so, the will comes often from the grounding. And I would just suggest that, if your team doesn't have the support to go do it, it's important to try to like build a story, because people are story motivated, right? We are narrative creatures. And so helping people understand the situation from their own experiences is great. And if you can tell a narrative that includes specific individuals, unlike everything I did here today, If you can include specific individuals and how their situation was bettered or made worse by specific interventions, then that has a lot of power.
Yeah. And my first websites were built on a 386, I think it was. And most, I think most of the people in the audience are like, what the heck's a 386?
Yeah.
It's that old. Really, really old and really not powerful. And then Sergey asks, with the cost of measurement being very high, both in tooling and expertise, what is the message we can deliver to management for them to start caring for users who are not rich, quote unquote, weirdos, as you call
The good news is, again, the missing statistic of INP is extremely clarifying because it does a couple of things for us. It helps us set a new price, not in our internal evaluation, but a global price that feeds into the SEO calculation because Google takes the site speed rankings that are based on the Core Vitals inputs and uses those to weight to some degree to weight search results. And so slow pages are going to do worse. And we have a lot of experience of the web ecosystem responding well to, I don't want to say well, responding to changes in ranking behavior by search engines. And so as that comes online in March, that for many classes of sites, not all of them, of course, but for many classes of sites, including retailers, e-commerce, most of the folks who make their money on the web, not behind a login gated session, those folks are going to have an incentive that they understand, and I hope that will be clarifying.
Okay, that's great. Oh, let's see, I think I've got the minute left or something. So one last question here from Brian. I see tools in your chart that can ship static pre-rendered pages without JS, but do not default to that mode. Seems to be less about the tool and more about the default use of it. Do you think there is more to it than this?
It's an extremely thoughtful insight. I love this question. Yes, there's more to it than this. It's cultural. The front end, the contemporary culture of front end has not valued users at the margins, and therefore it has valued other things. And those other things create their own incentives. Those incentives may have nothing to do with your product's success or failure, right? Those incentives may be more local. They may be making you feel good. They may be making, validating you as a special and important person who knows things inside of an organization, right? Like we've all worked in teams where there's some poor sod who lives in a closet, making the Webpack still work and hoping it doesn't all fall over someday. And that person is now indispensable, right? There are real things about our positions that we fear, I think, today because contemporary front end has devalued the user. So we cannot win in our organization's small game of Thrones necessarily by appealing to user values. We're going to fix that one product at a time and one team at a time. It will not get fixed all at once. There are big things like INP that will help, but this is the challenge right now for front end, is to heal our culture. Our culture has to stop saying that whatever Facebook excretes next week is going to be the future of web development and it'll be great because it's the future. We have to start asking, is it good, and for who and why? And it's good for us. Yeah.
And I think we have to accept that the process can be painful. Like I think this part of the thing is we default to these tools because hey, we know them. They're easy. We've been using them for years. And it's like,
but fundamentals will never say you wrong.
Right.
If you learn how a browser processes a web page, that is knowledge that will last as long as you care to be a web developer.
Right? Absolutely.
And it will trump anything else. It's superlative as in terms of efficiency of action and your ability to make small cuts for big impact. As soon as you learn those pieces, as soon as you learn how the systems a couple of layers below you actually function and stop relying on the user land abstraction to suss out what's going to happen next when you look at the web page that you're loading, it will make you a more effective engineer, and that effectiveness will play out over time to your benefit. So don't stress the small stuff, stress the fundamentals, and you'll be okay.